We're live, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we are back with episode 2 of Cryptid History Uncrypted. For those of you who watched last week, welcome back. We did a little bit of an intro to let you know why we're doing this. We're starting with a dive into the origins of social science, psychology, psychiatry, and we found some really interesting things to share with you for this week. Rachel gave me a little bit of a sneak peek at some of her theories, which I think are spot on, and we're gonna dive into that. I found a book which corroborates a lot of her theories. Super fascinating and dark and horrifying simultaneously.
That's kind of the usual around here for us.
Yeah.
Fascinating and also kind of horrifying.
Yes, seems to be the themes. Yeah. So I'm really new to all of this live stream stuff, and Rachel is really being very patient and gracious in guiding me and helping me. So
I'm kind of new to it too. My husband's the live stream ninja, so he's kind of helping me, and so we're figuring it out together.
Awesome. Well, she introduced me to Dono Chat, and so we have that linked here. I think we both have one. So we will read those at the end because I am visually impaired and I'm also not capable of multitasking. So,
well, it'll be good too, because that way people get a chance to hear all the information and then be thinking of their questions they have or maybe comments they want to make, because we have some pretty based viewership that sometimes you guys know things that we didn't know, and you can be like, hey, did you know about this? Or you guys should look into that. That happens a lot for us. So at the end, we're going to be taking questions, comments. If you guys want to support the show, our brand new little project here, mine's pinned to the top of my link. Courtenay also has hers pinned everywhere that she is. She's on Rockfin, Rumble, and then here on YouTube, and I'm just here on YouTube for now. So yeah, definitely feel free to support or ask questions, because that makes it more fun when we can interact with you guys. So
absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know where you want to start.
Well, okay. I think I've got a spot to start. So we've been doing a ton of research on this kind of stuff for a while, which is why we decided to do the series, because there's just so much. And I was kind of looking back over all my notes today and kind of thinking about it. And I was thinking about how there's this myth of scientific neutrality. That in our day and age, we assume that if something is considered a science, or it is performed in a clinical setting at all, if it's studied in a university, if there's people in white lab coats doing it, that it must be really solid. There must be evidence. It must have undergone this rigorous investigatory process. And, we just assume these things, and we assume that the people who are studying these things and performing the research are neutral, that they're just there performing the scientific method and trying to find things out. Well, that's never the case in any of the sciences, really. But especially here with psychology and psychiatry and social science, it's definitely not the case. So I think that's what this is really about, is us kind of exposing who the people were who created these fields and tried to make them a science, even though it's a soft science, and what their belief systems were, because there are humans behind the lab coats, and those humans have beliefs. They have like their own mind and way of thinking of things that affects how they're doing their work. So that's kind of what I was thinking to start with, and then we can just start with the chronological stuff I have here.
Awesome. I just want to add to that. The other thing about the science is that, and even in a lot of these articles and books that I pulled up, they actually say scientism versus science. And one of the main things that you see here is that it's really just, diverting and, abdicating all critical thinking to the quote unquote experts, and also taking things as face value. So if it's science, then whatever results they find, that they expect you not to question, because it's science, and so it's settled, which is actually very much contrary to the first rule of science, is that there's many questions cannot be answered, but there are no answers that cannot be questioned. That was Feynman, whole principle. And that is really what science is predicated on. However, we seem to have forgotten that. And now, both, I think, as a result of laziness and conditioning, people just don't ask questions, and they assume that if there's been a result and, any evidence brought forth, then it's just somehow it becomes fact. So
yeah, that's exactly what happens. And both you and I have done a lot of stuff on MK Ultra over the last few years.
yes.
And these first few episodes are going to lay the groundwork and explain how the hell did MK Ultra come out of this stuff? How did they get there in such a short period of time? Because you're talking about the establishment of psychology as a field in the very late 1800s, and by 1953, probably earlier, they're doing MK Ultra experiments on people. So it's like, whoa, how did it go from a brand new field to human experimentation on a mass scale worldwide like this, mind control experiments? And so that's kind of what we're laying the groundwork for as well here with what we're going to talk about. So shall we get into it?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. So I kind of started off, we gave you guys a little bit of an intro to the ethos in our last episode. I do talk about it a little bit in my book because hypnotism and somnambulance, which is what they called it before it was coined hypnotism.
Mm-hmm.
These things are really, really old, like go back to ancient times. But I think we can look to post-Enlightenment, early to mid 1800s, and see that's when people started to really try to turn psychology into a field of scientific study. And there's a whole bunch of people that were all, this is kind of how things work in history when you study history. There's always these groups of intellectuals that steer things. Yep. And that's why we're doing crypto history, because the stuff they teach you in school never mentions all the secret societies, the secretive groups, the clusters of intellectuals who, yes, they work in the university together during the day, but then what they're doing outside the university sometimes in their little groups gets a little crazy and a little wild. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely the case with psychology. So you had this middle to late 1800s group of intellectuals, mostly centered in Germany as well as England. Yeah. And it would have been people like Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller, who we're going to talk about some people you guys have probably never heard of, and then some really well-known people like Freud and Jung and some of those guys. But this guy was interesting to me because he, in 1902, was at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and wrote his PhD thesis on hypnotism. He was probably the first modern person to do that. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and I found this really interesting connection that so many of the people I looked into and did biopics on had clergy for parents, ministers and priests for parents.
Did.
So I don't fully know what that means, but I think
ministers and pastors, yeah,
I think the interest in the spiritual affected almost all of these people. Like I said, very few people came into this field with just a strict clinical mindset. Almost all of them had a background in religion, occult religion, Gnosticism, things like that ended up influencing their work. And this fellow, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps in World War I. This is going to be another super common thread through all the research. All these people serve in the war, whether it's World War I, World War II, Vietnam. War is like a theater for experimentation. You can get away with studying things during wartime that you can't really get away with any other time.
Yeah, so it's like we think
a lot of them end up in World War I working for like the Royal Army Medical Corps, like the German army, things like that, the Prussian army. And this fellow did that. And he was the one who founded the charitable clinic in Tavistock Square that would much later become the Tavistock Institute.
Which will be next week's.
Yes. And Courtenay is like she's like a professor of Tavistock studies, you guys. So you're going to love next week.
It's what started me on this really like going down most of this rabbit hole, because it was just this like monster shadow think tank that nobody had. I mean, I certainly had never heard of. So, and I realized all the connections that it had. So that was actually really what like kind of opened the floodgates for me. So
Yeah, for sure. And so Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller was the one who opened this clinic in Tavistock Square out of concern for shell shock sufferers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is one of those things that you see all the time that I highly question. It's this idea of, oh, it all just came out of concern for people who had shell shock in World War I. Like, maybe, but also no, because there was things going on prior to that, right? There were things going on prior to World War I that were pretty crazy. Like this doctor who started Tavistock was a popular lecturer on the new psychology based on all of Jung's work. And Jung was very much into the occult. He was very deep into that stuff, and people don't know this.
So it didn't arrive yet, but there's a whole book on it, on Jung's occultic influences, and he was also a mystic, and he was agent 488, so he's a double agent for the OSS and the United States. So he was
that's another super common theme.
Yes.
That for whatever reason, anyone we look into often ends up being wrapped up with intelligence. It's always like this Venn diagram of overlap between like intelligence, theaters of war, espionage, and the occult.
Yes.
That you just see repeat all throughout at least the last 150 years, probably.
And then
longer.
They use the secret societies to kind of do their bidding. That's really, and that's like a new thing that's actually a new theory that I have, because I don't know if you saw, I don't know if I have it with me. Oh, I do. So this is the front page of Life magazine right now, which is a very like mainstream outlet, and they're talking about the quote unquote secret societies, which clearly are not so secret since they're on the front page of Life magazine. But I think that they're kind of letting that cat out of the bag, so to speak, because they don't want you to pay attention to what's really happening, which is that they're kind of the conduit for all of the intelligence apparatus and the academic and think tank institutions, and they work through them, but they want you not to look that way, because that's really where all the action is taking place and how it's being executed.
Yes, exactly. So these people who are kind of secret power players who have steered the course of history are usually not just in one, but are oftentimes in multiple secret societies that also have overlap. And the modern version of that, we still have those things for sure. We still have secret clubs, secret societies, but they've got a more official way of doing it now, which is they're on the board of something, right? They're on the board of a philanthropic organization. They're on the board of a nonprofit group. They're on the board of some NGO. It's kind of like the new secret society in a way, because you look at this stuff, you look into these people, and it's like, how can you have time possibly as a human to be on like 12 different boards at once?
Right.
And it's the same kind of people overlapping on all these different boards. And so I think it's just like a way to make it seem really above board and really like non-suspicious that I'm in all of these powerful groups that tend to steer the direction of what's happening. And that's what happened with psychology, for sure.
Yes, and I think they use, so I would say the philanthropy is essentially just like a euphemism for money laundering. And, they've created this nice little like loophole for themselves in order to essentially money launder and embezzle. But then they use philosophies to justify their behaviors. So the philosophy behind philanthropy is supposedly charitable, and eleemosynary, which clearly it isn't. And then they have other philosophies like the whole philosophy behind Sam Bankman-Fried, effective altruism, which is essentially just a justification for the powerful elite to steal your money and then to tell you that they're such good people for doing so.
Yes, they're just helping you. That's always what it is. And that's certainly the case here, as I said, with Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller founding this charitable clinic out of supposed concern for shell shock sufferers. And as always, you look into it and find, did they help the shell shock sufferers? Not really. Did they find any cures? Did those people get better? Not really. But they did get to do a lot of free experimentation on people, right? So these were like vulnerable people, the mentally ill, the insane, people who have suffered horrible war trauma. It's very easy to do experimentation on them under the guise of helping them, because they don't even have anywhere else to go, right? There's no other treatment at that time. So along with founding Tavistock Clinic, he was the first president and founder of the British Psychological Society, which is a big, influential,
huge.
It's super influential, but small, right? Yeah. So the first few, there was only like 10 members because this was new, and it was founded in 1901 at the University of College London, which comes up all the time in our research too. And I noticed some threads throughout these people. They're mostly names that you wouldn't probably know, but a lot of people who were knighted by the Queen. Everybody is a member of the Royal Society. Many of them served in the Royal Army during World War I. And there were a couple of Freemasons. And they were generally, one of them, Alexander Faulkner Shand, is the great-grandfather of Queen Consort Camilla Parker Bowles. So I thought that was interesting.
Camellia Parker Bowles, right?
Yeah.
The Bowles, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was also started by Dr. Ernest Jones, who was like known as like the way Thomas Henry Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog. That's kind of what he was known to Freud.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't know prior to doing this project how much Darwinism affected this field.
Me either.
It was so crazy. It was like when Darwin came up with his thesis on the, origin of species and evolution. This is really what kicked this off. This is really what got psychology going, because there was this underlying assumption, which has now been debunked publicly, but I feel like the elites still follow this line of thinking, that we were once great, that human beings in pre-ancient history were once these great, it's almost like a Gnostic Garden of Eden. There's a lot of Gnosticism in this. Yeah. This Gnostic Garden of Eden idea that we were once so knowledgeable, we were like a super race, and that we are actually in the process of devolving.
Yeah.
And that it's incumbent upon us then to take control of nature, steer evolution, and point it toward transhumanism, where we can escape this earthly, Gnostic, fleshy prison that we're all in, where we have to get sick and die and have mental illness. So it was like this idea, this is what ties into my super bizarre theory.
This is the positive eugenics versus the negative eugenics, right?
Yes. Yeah. And of course, you and I would never agree with them on what they consider to be positive eugenics. No. Their form of positive eugenics is just get rid of everyone who's not us.
Pretty much. And what's really interesting, that just it speaks to the founding of the field of psychology. Again, this notion of like justifying their, basically their theses and their worldview, and of course the advancement and the empowerment of them, as an elite group. But one of the things that they were doing was trying to weed out the of course the mentally lesser than. And this is where they came up. This is why the psychologists came up with the IQ testing, and they were obsessed with the IQ testing. And interestingly enough, Mensa actually has a eugenics division. Like they're a division that's like specifically devoted to eugenics. They've since taken it off their website, but I guess it wasn't all that popular. But
and you guys, eugenics never went away.
No,
it never went away. It was just renamed, like the Galton Society has renamed itself like 5 times to try to make it sound better. And it's still doing the same thing it did when it was just straight up eugenics. It's just that they just rebrand, right? Yeah. Just like how abortion is healthcare now. They just take things and they reframe it and they try to make it sound really altruistic. We're just here to help. We're just helping. So like I found something super interesting. There was a psychologist and doctor named Ernst Haeckel who came up with this early theory of recapitulation, which is, it's strange for me being Orthodox and having the recapitulation theory of atonement, and then them having like basically their own evolution version of the recapitulation theory, which was like, he said you could look at the development cycle of an embryo, or you could look at what they thought at the time was like the evolution of a bird, where it used to have a thicker beak, and then over time it adapts to have like maybe a smaller, pointier beak, something like that. He would say you could look at this this evolution of like an embryo, and you could see it repeat on a macro scale throughout nature and then also in the adult life cycle of people. And this is part of what got Freud thinking that everything went back to your sexuality as an infant and your secret desires for your mom, and the other kind of weird, bizarre theories he came up with was because they thought everything was like from infancy and it was just repeating throughout your life. But this gave him a very interesting theory. So he did believe in the inheritability of behavior and mental health.
A lot of them did.
They almost all did. Almost all of them were very into eugenics and evolution steering and speeding. So this is something that's happening right now with like Elon Musk, Neuralink, all of the transhumanists that we're dealing with now, where they not only do they want to steer evolution, the evolution of the human species, but they want to speed it up, right? And this fellow, Ernst Haeckel, he was a monist. Like he had a very interesting, very progressive type of religious view. And this was another thing I found is like people would say they were Christian, but they really weren't. So like Unitarian back then was a code word for a cultist who kind of likes Jesus. Like Jesus is cool and I'm into the occult was kind of their thing. And as a monist, this Dr. Haeckel thought that we were all going to become transhuman, return to the one, become the big blob of like oneness, you know, that everybody feels we're going to be when they've done too many psychedelics. And he believed in a theory that had been put forth by Helena Blavatsky and others at the time about a lost civilization. And this comes up a lot. So here's my weird theory, you guys. It's going to get weird now, okay? So he believed, because you guys remember the missing link that's never been found. And now they have wiggled their way out of why they can't find a missing link and why they're all hoaxes because they've changed the theory. But we're talking about 100 years ago when they still believed that they would find this missing link in the fossil record. And they didn't know why they hadn't found it anywhere yet. And his theory was that there was an ancient lost kingdom called Lemuria. The name came from this idea that they didn't understand how they could find lemurs in like India and then find the same species of lemurs on islands in the ocean. And so they thought there must have been a land bridge, right, that had sunk into the ocean, and with it sank this missing link race of proto-humans. And that if they could find this, it would hold the key to steering evolution. It would hold the key to doing eugenics in a proper way so that we could make everybody superhuman and we could transcend humanity and death and disease. Very weird. And so what else was going on around the same time? We're talking about turn of the century here. The Bolsheviks had Nicholas Roerich and others who believed in the kingdom of Shambhala, which is very similar to Lemuria. It's supposed to be in Tibet somewhere, they thought. This is why you see a lot of theosophists and intelligence people trying to go to Tibet around the time that the Bolsheviks took power, because they thought there was some kind of holy grail, mystical thing, artifact, people, something they would find there that would give them the key to becoming a super race. The Nazis thought the same thing. So what should we call them? The Mean Mr. Mustache clan thought that they would find Hyperborea and that it would have the same thing, this idea of an ancient lost race that would hold the key to, instead of devolving as a species, evolving into superhumans. So really, I think World War I and World War II, to a large degree, under the surface, were about these elites in different kingdoms, different nations, looking for a missing link from a lost civilization that was going to make them superhumans and give them power over the rest of the world. I know, it sounds nutty, but how else do you explain all these? And there's more of them. There's
demystify it a little bit. A lot of the Nazis did say that they wanted to summon up dark spirits because that would give them the esoteric knowledge and technology to be able to execute their plans.
Yes.
So,
yes,
that's what they kind of said it.
Yeah, they did say it, but it's the reason it sounds so wacky is because mainline historians have just dismissed all of that.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk about that. It's too weird. It's too bizarre. They just say, oh, they were racist. They were just racist and thought white people were the best. But you had Rudolf Steiner at the same time looking for the lost kingdom of Agartha, which was supposed to be also around this same area. And Atlantis. It's all kind of the same type of a myth where they believed that in ancient times these people were superior, had crazy technology, they were a race of superhumans, and that we've been devolving ever since then, and that in order to go back to that, you've got to find this lost kingdom.
Right.
And all of these psychologists we're talking about who were in the British Psychology Society, in Freud's Wednesday Club, a lot of them believed in this.
And they were all doing all of these like very ancient type of mystical black magic practices. That's what most of what, became psychoanalysis stems from. It was like you had mentioned the hypnotism, there was magnetism. They were actively seeking telepathy. Freud and Jung were going back and forth. And this was actually where Ernest Jones was super jealous because he couldn't understand it, but he very much like wanted to, and he wanted to have these powers. They talked about hauntings and hallucinations and being able to utilize those. And then of course, drugs, right? Like, that was one of, from really early on, Freud talks about like the discovery of cocaine and how it was he was going to
pop. He really liked cocaine.
He really liked cocaine, and he wanted all of
cocaine was a super drug, and it was awesome. Yeah, well, I mean, it was.
And then we wonder about modern. Yeah, we wonder about modern psychiatrists prescribing Adderall and Ritalin to everyone. This is not new.
No, like, it's not new at all.
Freud did.
Yeah.
I just wanted to read this because this is just, it goes all the way back to Nietzsche, and this is exactly what you're saying. It doesn't talk about the missing link, but this is, so he says, do you believe that the sciences would have arisen and grown up if the sorcerers, alchemists, astrologers, and witches who had not been their forerunners, those who with their promising and foreshadowing had first to create a thirst, a hunger, and a taste for hidden and forbidden powers in 1882? Yeah, that's Nietzsche. Yeah. So,
and he's right, because like we were saying, when you go back and read the writings of these people who were the pioneers of psychology and psychiatry, they were looking for the philosopher's stone. They were looking for ancient lost civilizations. They were looking for keys to power. They were looking for, how do we control the human mind, the most powerful force on earth? How do we grab the reins of this? And so, yes, they had, going back to ancient times, but there was a renewed interest in the 17 and 1800s around hypnotism, magnetism. There was a very obscure Portuguese, he said he was a priest. I think he was maybe a Jesuit. It doesn't really say. There's not much known about his life, but he was accused of by the church of being an occultist because he would do magnetic seances.
Yeah.
Now, I looked and couldn't find much about exactly what that would have entailed. And it's probably because we don't know much about this guy, but he did write a book that was popular at the time, and he was doing something called magnetic seances.
Yeah, well, it stemmed from Franz Mesmer.
Yeah, Franz Mesmer. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This guy was a contemporary of Mesmer, but he disagreed with him about, like, he kind of thought Mesmer was a hack who was being too suggestive with people. And his theory was more kind of what gave them this idea of the subconscious mind of, I'm not going to suggest much to you. I'm just going to open you up and see what comes out, which this is another thing. It's like, what happens when we open up parts of the mind that we don't know about?
This with the push for, all the psychedelics again, but now we're going to use it as a therapeutic adjunct and guide. And it's because we can dissolve all these boundaries, and now we can, So I think it's the same thing, but
yeah. So they were kind of just doing black magic, but telling everyone it was science. It's really how you can kind of think of it. Is like they were, they're trying to find the power of the subconscious. They're trying to interpret dreams. They're trying to manifest things, right? We're going to take whatever's in your subconscious and see if we can manifest it. We're going to, see if we can harness whatever power we think it is within people. So like Mesmer thought there was magnetism in the blood. He thought it was in the blood. Others thought it was in the brain. Others thought it was, you know,
He did think it was the sixth sense, though.
Yeah.
Mesmer. Yeah. He had a sixth sense ability, which would enable the perception of distant events, clairvoyance, and the knowledge of other languages.
Yeah. So early psychology, it hasn't really changed, but especially when you read what these people were writing, it's like they knew there was a spiritual occult aspect to things, and that's why they came up with the name psychology. It means study of the soul. And then they knew there was a medical component, and this component was inspired by early Darwinism, by Charles Darwin, by Darwin's circles, by the early theory of evolution. And so they were trying to figure out, how do we scientifically merge these things, which is why you find so much overlap with theosophy or anthroposophy, which was Rudolf Steiner's occult religion, because those two things were supposed to be a modern blending of ancient Eastern occult religion and modern Western science, right? So really, that's what psychology is. Psychology is just like, okay, we're gonna study occult religion and like medical biological evolution, and we're going to do it in a university in a clinical setting. That's what they were doing.
Yeah. And I think also to legitimize it so that people followed it, and to pull people away from more traditional, like religious and community and familial type of therapeutic kind of treatments, or just well-being, essentially. But it was to pull people away from that into a more systematized path that they could claim was legitimate because it was systematized, and then they could also create a whole field of study and schooling and degrees around it, which would be a vehicle for them to indoctrinate and to control, and also to create these little boards and clubs and secret organizations in which they could seize power and control over others.
Yes. So you immediately find them very high up in all the institutions, almost immediately, because the people who created the field were already generally in the institutions. So you'll find them in like the most influential universities of the time, the Royal Society, many Freemasons, people I didn't even know were Freemasons. I didn't know that Freud was a member of the
B'nai B'rith in Vienna, which according to the Executive Intelligence Report says that was actually an offshoot of the MI5, British intelligence. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
And
that, but that's what was in that report.
We think a lot of theosophy was also British intelligence.
Probably.
And this is why you saw so many of these people like Blavatsky, and then a little bit later, Annie Besant and Ledbetter, going to India, going to Tibet to set up, temples, churches, orphanages, things like this. It was kind of a way to get into Tibet, which was pretty walled off and cut off from the West. And you could kind of only get in there if you pretended you were into Buddhism, really, and things of that nature. And I think that they were gathering intelligence there as well. Who else do I have here? Oh, yes. So there's an interesting connection with the families of Darwin and Galton. They go back a few hundred years as pals. They were a very influential family that kind of had lots of fingers and lots of pies, a lot of Freemasons. Erasmus Darwin was a Freemason, 2 of his sons, and likely Charles Darwin. I don't think they've ever been able to find him on an actual membership roll.
Right.
But they're pretty sure he was. And they had something called the Lunar Society, which immediately, to call it the Lunar Society is like already occultic. But it lasted from 1765 to 1813, and it was very influential Englishmen who were into the occult and like the very early psychology, hypnotism, trying to figure out how to harness the human mind and the intellect, and trying to figure out how to be influential and disseminate whatever it was they wanted out into the public and into the institutions of the time. So Sir Francis Galton, famous eugenicist, was into psychology.
He started the Eugenics Society. Yeah.
Yes. And he founded psychometrics and differential psychology, which was studying the differences in individual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that civilization diminished natural selection, right? So they're all working off of this early Darwinian model, thinking that we are gradually deteriorating, and that
They were like a feedback loop. So they were actually related. They were cousins, and they very much influenced each other. There's lots of letters and correspondence between Darwin and Galton, and
yes, they
you could
were.
see the intellectual influence back and forth.
Yeah, Erasmus Darwin
Very
was their
fond of each
mutual
other.
grandparent, and he was a member of a Scottish Rite Freemason lodge. His sons were, the Darwin Wedgwood families, who they are, and it was very interesting because, like I said, I never thought about the fact that these people were under the impression that humanity was not evolving to improve, and this is so counter to what I was taught in like high school biology, that natural selection improves species.
Right.
It helps them adapt and it makes them better. That was not the original theory. They thought that civilization had ruined natural selection and that we had to. So this is a lot of the reasoning behind why they want to get rid of so many people and be so controlling and harness nature and try to take back natural selection, because they thought the species was devolving. And they also thought this was a big thing in the early study of psychology, was that mental illness was heritable, and that with each generation that you had a disability, a mental illness, a mental disability.
Well, they actually created the term. So a lot of it wasn't even a discovery as much as it was, really like confirmation bias. They basically created these labels in order to then, be able to execute their quote unquote treatments, and so that they could advance this, because they felt that, the natural selection, as you're saying, wouldn't just naturally happen. It was incumbent upon them. And of course, they know better than everybody else because they're the elite. And so they need to steer the natural selection process, which doesn't sound very natural, does it? I mean,
it doesn't. But that's the thing, is that they had this belief that unless they did something, it's very similar to the climate cults of today, where it's like, oh, everything's going to turn out terrible unless we control nature and fix everything, right? So that's what they thought. And they thought that with each successive generation, whatever mental illness, disability, whatever was quote unquote wrong with you would only get worse. Now that was disproved really quickly. I mean, it was like a decade or two and they went, oh, wait, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't fit. I mean, we see this all the time. Like, I have a severely mentally ill parent and I'm really mentally stable. I know it might not seem like it sometimes, but I've never had any issue with like real mental illness or anything like that. It's something they disproved really quickly, but for whatever reason, I think because of their underlying spiritual and occultic beliefs, they really held on to this idea that no, we have to be the ones who choose who goes into the future. And they still talk about this today, right?
Yeah, it really ignores epigenetics. I mean, right? Like, so it completely favors genetics, which we now know that they know so little about actual genetics. We also know that so much of the fundraising and the studies around genetics were actually kind of a sham. It was done so they could manipulate, or they try to. I don't think they've actually been all that successful. I think that they want us to believe they've been a lot more successful than they have, because they want to scare us. But for instance, they like us to believe that they can actually do genetic manipulation and that they can edit genes. What they can do is gene deletion. So they can take out something, but they can't actually put things in or rearrange things. So that's just one example. There's so little that they understand, and they just want you to believe that they have this power that they don't actually have. And it's partly because they are sorcerers and wizards, and they think that if they cast the spell, right, just by telling you, then you'll believe it and it'll be so. I just wanted to add something else just to corroborate what you're saying, because there's actually the American Eugenics Society reveals that 31 presidents of the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, have been between 1892, which was when Stanley G. Hall, we'll get to him because he has lots of ties to, Skull and Bones and the Illuminati, and to Wilhelm Wundt, who was known as the father of psychology. So between him and then in 1947, which is when Carl Rogers was the president, so they were publicly listed as leaders of the various eugenic organization. That's a huge number in a short span of time. So that shows you these people really were eugenicists. That is like the driving philosophy behind these people. So
yes, absolutely. I think that it's really nutty that psychology is really just eugenicists who are into the occult, basically. Like, if you just wanted to be like really basic and boil it down, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, it is. They had titles like the field of eugenic reform. There was what was the other one? A few of the APA presidents not only published positive reviews of eugenic books, but also produced studies on supposed differences in national character, showing striking national difference, found between the different different races and their capacity for empathy or lack thereof, which is really interesting also because we now know that you can actually create a psychopath. So one of the core components of a psychopath is that they're devoid of empathy, which it's actually much more nuanced than that. People think they just don't have empathy, but really what they have is a very keen sense of what empathy is. They may not necessarily be affected by it, but they know they can determine it in others, and they know how to manipulate it to serve advance their own goals and agendas. So yeah.
So the British Psychological Society, this first body founded in 1901. I'll just do a quick rundown of the founding members and some key facts about them. So Robert Armstrong Jones, he was a Royal Army Medical Corps officer during World War I, member of the Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Surgeons. He ran an asylum and was knighted by the Queen and was a fellow of the Royal Society. Sophie Bryant, who was a feminist activist, of course, the only woman.
Armstrong was also a member of the Eugenics Society.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Like, I think every single one of these people was. This lady was a member of the London Ethical Society. She was a humanist atheist, also into eugenics, and was childhood friends with George Bernard Shaw, which I thought was interesting. W.R. Boyce Gibson, son of a Methodist minister. He references...
was a Fabian socialist. So,
references G. Stanley Hall in his work, God with Us. In the preface, Rudolph Eucken gives thanks to the Hibbert Trust for funding his work. The Hibbert Trust is interesting because it was designed to develop unorthodox Christianity under a monist Unitarian ethos, and it wanted to protect progressive liberal religion. In fact, I would say one of the key words when we're talking about this is progressive, because all of these people thought they were ushering in a new age of progress. So scientifically, they wanted progress. Spiritually and religiously, they were all what we would now look back and consider new age. So like theosophy, the Baha'i faith, there's surprisingly a lot of Baha'i faith people involved in this, which is like the ultimate ecumenist universal religion that was proto New Age, which had a lot of overlap with theosophy. So that was him, and that Hibbert Trust is still around today, and it supports Black Lives Matter and all kinds of really ultra progressive left wing stuff in the UK. Frank Noel Hales, he was invited to join members of the Rothschild family on a tour of Europe and tutored one of their sons. Other than that, he didn't seem to do a lot of work. He retired from psychology and moved to Canada, but he was really close with the Rothschild family. William McDougall, somebody who's a little more well-known, University College London, Oxford, Harvard, all these people are in the big influential universities, right? He established parapsychology as a field and opened the first lab at Duke University here. And he is a Royal Society fellow, a member of the Eugenics Society. He was a friend of Galton. He was very into scientific racism. That was like one of his big things. So parapsychology and scientific racism was this guy's jam, which seems weird. He was into like animism and panpsychism. So he thought there was like some substance that gave things consciousness. And he was his studies were mostly on like telepathy. He wanted to scientifically prove telepathy. So again, another person trying to, basically this was a bunch of nerds, you guys, all trying to like mind battle each other back, 120, 30 years ago. It's nuts.
They were, and they were really trying to read minds. What's interesting when you read a lot of Freud's confessions, and he talks about, and Jung too, especially in their letters back and forth to each other, they talk about like trying to read their patients' minds. And this is one of the biggest problems that I actually have with the field in general, is because psychoanalysis in particular endows the therapist with so much power. And what often happens is that instead of actually reading their minds, contrary to what they might want you to believe, because they want you to believe they have these magical powers, what they actually end up doing is projecting onto the patient. And this is where real damage can be done. This is where it can actually be really, really harmful to that individual, because now you're taking a set of circumstances, a personality, motives, and just literally thoughts that may not be from them at all, and projecting them onto them, which is one, confusing, disorienting, and two, can actually create trauma that wasn't there. So that's one of my biggest.
Some of them really wanted to do that. It was very much like, let's see what happens when we totally screw with the human psyche. Let's see what happens when we introduce things or take things away. They were programming. So from the earliest days of psychoanalysis, there's going to be some level of programming. That's why I started by talking about this myth of neutrality, because you're not trying to dig into someone's subconscious or their psyche and see what you can do in there unless you have some level of intent, right? I mean, you can't be just neutral. I'm just curious. I just want to see what's deep in the recesses of your mind.
This is like when I talk about, like one of the things I talk about all the time, because I'm so concerned about the CBDCs, and how Biden issued that executive order 14067 on March 9th, and then it went into effect on December 13th of 2022. And the pushback I get all the time is, Courtenay, don't worry about that. That's just research. I'm like, right, because they just spend an inordinate amount of time, resources, and money on research that for no reason. I mean, the research, it's just fun.
We're just curious.
Yeah.
Curious. I just want to see what'll happen. So I just have three more quick people from the British Psychological Society. Sir Frederick Walker Mott, of course, knighted by the Queen, Royal Society Fellow. He lectured at the Eugenics Education Society. William Halsey Rivers went to work with Emil Kraepelin, who I will talk a little bit about later. His work was the basis of much of the Nazi eugenics programs. And then Alexander Faulkner Shand, who was the great-grandfather of Camilla Parker Bowles, who is now the Queen Consort. So these weren't people you may have heard their name, but they were tied in with the most powerful people of their day. Yeah. And they were all super into eugenics, and they were going to fix humanity. What could go wrong, right?
Yeah, what could go wrong? And they believe there are too many of us, and that we should be naturally, quote unquote, selected out. But don't worry, nothing will
It'll be fine. It's fine.
It'll be fine. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about G. Stanley Hall now? Should we go to him?
Yeah, let's go to him.
Have something before him that you want to do?
Well, I guess we could do him first and then go into Wilhelm Wundt, because I just think Wilhelm Wundt is kind of relevant, and he's like a little bit of a linchpin to a lot of this, but I don't know which one you want to start with.
Well, maybe we'll start with Wundt, because Hall went to study with him.
Yes, he did. He was one of the few Americans who studied with him and got his PhD under him. I think there was, 147 PhD students under Wundt?
Yeah.
Something like that. That's a lot for someone who personally had no degrees at all. Yeah. Wundt's philosophical worldview was very much aligned with the New World Order that we would call today. He believed he saw history as going through a series of stages from primitive tribes to an age of heroes, and then to formation of nation states, culminating in a world state based on the concept of humanity as the whole. So this is the same kind of thing you're talking about with the New Age and with the monads, this idea that we are all one and we're returning to the one. And he was very much a proponent of that. He was very influenced. One of his primary influences, philosophically speaking, was Hegel. And Hegel he was an alchemist, and he very much believed in, we often hear the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That was actually really Kant who said that. Hegel actually said, it was the concrete, negation, and abstract. And the abstract was actually kind of the opposite of what you would think it would be, because it is kind of a synthesis. It was this notion of all these different parts and how they integrate. But the really important part of Hegel's concept of the Hegelian dialectic was the negation, because it is through this negation that, when you hear certainly the Illuminati phrase was order through chaos. And negation is how we get that chaos, because that's where we get Afhaven to culture, is through that negation. And negation, Afhaven culture is an interesting term just because it's an oxymoron in itself, because it's this notion of keeping up, maintaining while tearing down. And this is why you have the shell of things. This is why they rebrand and they rename things, because the name may be there, but then they've, of course, destroyed what it means. And so it has no meaning, and it's confusing and creates chaos. So those were his influences. And who else was there? Yeah, he believed that the purpose was to develop personal character and social morality. The most important task of an educator was to analyze activities and the duties of men within society, because the state was the god. So essentially, it was all about creating the ultimate state, and that becomes the one, and man is just continuously discarded throughout history to serve the state. So these are the worldviews of Wundt, who created the field of psychology. He wasn't really somebody who was who believed in the individual. He wasn't somebody who came from certainly not a traditional kind of spiritual view. It was spiritual in a sense of more of a Gnostic type or a Hermetic kind of worldview, where they believed that they were gods, and of course that the state was God. And they would create the perfect state, which would ultimately lead to this, universal one world governance.
Yeah. That was the goal of a lot of these people. Again, when you read them, it's like obedience to the state, creation of, and this was a lot of the justification for eugenics too, was like, it's the welfare of the state. It's the collective. It's the greater good. We have to improve humanity. And like G. Stanley Hall was definitely on this too. And it's probably because he studied with him. And it was really the same kind of spirit we have now, where it's like, oh, all of that God stuff is like outdated. We're scientists. We know things. We have gnosis, so we can fix all the things that are wrong with creation. No, zero humility. Like the cornerstones of Christianity are humility and repentance, and they hated those things.
Yes.
They wanted to have the control themselves. We can figure it out with our own brain, the power of the human mind, and we're special and we're elite. And through our little secret clubs that we have, we're going to fix everything.
And that was the goal of the Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt officially formulated in 1776. I think it was May 5th of 1776. And their goal, of course, was world domination, but they believed they would achieve that through overthrowing all governments and all religions. And they talked about how they had to create society, the state, submissiveness as a false religion. They knew that it was through creating a religious type of fervor that they would then create the movement, and they could also infiltrate. So that's when they infiltrated through the Masonic lodges and
Yes.
through a lot of religious institutions as well. So.
Yep, they created religious institutions and new types of schools. So
yes.
One thing we had going on in Russia with Maxim Gorky and Anatoly Lunacharsky, they had this idea called God building, which means like Lenin wanted to get rid of religion, get rid of God, make everyone atheist. And these two understood that you can't really do that. Spirituality is a part of humanity. So they said, we can build a new God, which will be the state. And these were international communists. So they thought, we'll build up Russia, and then Russia will become like the world state, the world government. It like they all wanted globalism, but they all wanted to be in charge of it, kind of,
Yeah.
So like,
I always talk about this with like Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Lenin, Stalin and Hitler. When people are like, Hitler was a fascist and Stalin was a communist, and I'm like, no, it was like a battle of men, not a battle of ideology.
These like really, when it comes down to it, the ideology was very like secondary to really their spiritual beliefs and their worldviews about what they thought the future should be. And of course, they all wanted to be in charge of it. And so did these people. This was the science of how to do that, know? So we had God building, we had these monist underpinnings, these occultic, Gnostic, Hermetic underpinnings. You had, what was I going to say? Oh, the schools, the Steiner Waldorf schools at the time. And these are still around, and there's like 16 of them that are affiliated with UNESCO, which shouldn't shock us because we already mentioned Darwin and Huxley, and that was Thomas Huxley, and then of course Aldous Huxley and his brother Julian Huxley starts UNESCO, and they implement Steiner Waldorf schools, which is going to teach the kids all of this kind of stuff. They're into anthroposophy and the Akashic records, and these are like diehard occultists, and UNESCO is like, yes, let's endorse their schools. Right? Because why? Because the occult is the new one world religion. It's the new world order. So that's why these things are always tied together. The politics of it is just an extension. It's just one aspect. It's always really about the underlying.
I think it's really just a tool. I actually think politics, and a lot of these people talk about that. I mean, the certainly the Illuminati talks about that. The when you look at a lot of these like Stanley Hall and Gilman, they all talk about like the political arm being just a tool in order to execute their vision of what they've felt was best for man. It just didn't happen to entail being pro-humanity, but
yeah. Well, it never is. It's always Luciferian, really, underneath. Yeah. But just want to remind you guys really fast, quick, quack. I mixed them together. Apparently my brain shuts off at 10 p.m. There's a Dono chat link pinned to the top of all of our chats. So all of Courtney's chats and my chat, there's a Dono link. If you guys want to send a donation with a question, we want to answer questions. If you have questions about this stuff, if you have comments about it or things you want to see us cover in the future, anything like that, or you just want to support our new little project show here, we would be very thankful. So please consider sending us a Dono chat, and we will read them at the end. So, so do you have anything else on Wundt?
Yeah, I'm looking through. I'm trying to find all of the, because he had a lot of connections. So I just want to make sure I get these all right. He was influenced by Herbert, who was an educational theorist as well as philosopher. Let's just see where. And Herbert was at the University of Jena, and then later at Goethe, and he was in connection with Pestalozzi, and Pestalozzi was a direct connection to the Illuminati. He was reported to be, okay, let's see. He was known to be Eberus in the. No, sorry, wait, that was Fitch, who was connected to Herbert, to Pestalozzi. Sorry, they're all these different. They're all like connected. Yeah, Pestalozzi was known to be Alfred in the Illuminati Code. Okay. And then All right, let's see, where else were we?
I do have here about Wundt that he was greatly influenced by the flood of writing on hypnotism and spiritualism at the time.
It was.
He was very into that. And he kind of defined psychology as empirical humanities science, but combined physiology, philosophy, ethics, logic, and epistemology with these like parapsychology, occultic type of things.
Yes, he called it introspection psychology, but it would really be better translated as observation. And I see him kind of as a forerunner to Skinner. It's really like he was the one who took it into a like systematic kind of biological science where we're observing the behavior and then manipulating based on the behaviors that we see. So think of like the Skinner box. I think it really started with Wundt, and it was because he really wanted to be able to, he wanted it to be perceived as a hard science. And, obviously we see that, it's based on things like, hypnotism and a lot of and parapsychology. So it's really not hard science, but that's really what he wanted to garner that respect.
Yes.
And so, yeah. So that's where he was drawing most of that. But I do think it was the forerunner to Skinner. And
he had some really influential students when he came to America and trained people here. James McKean Cattell was the first U.S. Psych professor. Granville Stanley Hall, who we're going to talk about.
Yes.
Charles Hubbard Judd, who was at the University of Chicago, and then Walter Dill Scott, who they put in Harvard. So this is something I've written about before, where the elites, the way they influence, the way they infiltrate all the institutions and get they corner the market on the ideology or what is taught to people, is they will train their minions and then place their minions in the most influential institutions, whether it's universities, churches, government, media, marketing, all of that stuff. So this happened immediately right out of the gate. As soon as the first experimental psychology lab was formed, whoever their students were, whoever they liked, whoever was going to teach what they wanted, they put them in the most influential institutions in Europe and the United States.
Yes. Yeah. So should we move on to Hall?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about him on the episode I did with James Kleisek and the founding of the educational system.
Yeah, that makes sense because I mean, a lot of where I'm getting this from is actually Anthony Sutton's America's Secret Establishment, Order of Skull and Bones. And there's a whole section on the order and education. It's how the order controls education. And it was so he goes through all of these connections that Hall and Gilman had, and Hall was obviously, he was one of the Americans to get the PhD under Wundt. So,
yep. Yeah, and he was also the person who invited Freud to his only trip to the United States at Clark University.
And Freud was busy trying to schedule some sort of other trip, and it was like a pretty mystical trip, and that got derailed because he got this invitation.
Yeah. So Granville Stanley Hall is the guy I was talking about who was so heavily influenced by Ernst Haeckel's recapitulation theory of evolution. That really kind of steered his whole view of how these things should be done. He was, very much a social Darwinist, Darwinian evolution, all that kind of stuff. So, and he was super influential on the education system. Psychology in general is extremely influential on the education system because
William James is known as being like the father of American psychology. And he was, of course, alongside with Dewey as one of the founders of the modern education system in America.
Yep. And they were both friends with G. Stanley Hall, both of them. And all of them studied under Wundt. So it all kind of comes from the same place. And Hall was one of the founding members of the American Society for Psychical Research. So he did a lot of lot of research on psychics. He did debunk some of them.
Yeah.
And he did end up leaving that society because he became a skeptic of parapsychology because so many of them ended up being frauds. But he was super deeply into this German concept of Volk, which is where again, another theme where the individual dissolves into the transcendental collective. Mm-hmm. So this is a really important thing for us to keep hammering on, because the people who are in charge of figuring out how your mind works believe that the individual needs to dissolve into the collective. He had the same idea that the state should be God, and he was very opposed to sympathy for the poor, the sick, or disabled. Yeah, he really thought that you should have no mercy and no sympathy for them. They were just disposable. They should be gotten rid of. They were bringing down the future of humanity. He believed in selective breeding and forced sterilization.
Yeah. And one other thing I forgot about Wundt is this was another one of his Hegelian influences. He says that they were constantly seeking synthesis to reconcile opposites into higher truth. Psychological synthesis was a key element. So
yeah. I mean, it's going to be central. If you're one of these people, you need to know how to get everyone to go along with this stuff, because most people don't want to be eliminated.
And one other thing that
he don't want to be sterilized.
No, exactly. And one of his other contribution was structuralism, which he later abandoned because it didn't work. But structuralism is really, really interesting because it's kind of the forerunner to a lot of the postmodernism and the manipulation of linguistics and language, which is what they're always doing. As we were saying before, it's like kind of how they cast spells. I think that in that regard, they see themselves as, doing alchemy through words and through language. Yes. And he realized that he really couldn't push that, and it just didn't work.
Yeah. Well, so remember that we just told you this guy had such a big influence on the education systems in Europe and America at the time. And his belief was that, well, for one thing, he did a lot of studies on only children and thought that being an only child was a disease, that that only children were always going to turn out like really screwed up and awful. Yeah. He also believed that children are just savages and that it's a waste of time to reason with them. You just have to beat them until they submit. So that might be one reason why, public school never really did it for me. I'm not really into the masochism thing. I don't like getting punitively punished every time I wrong think.
Right.
So his idea of the evolution of child development was this recapitulation theory, and he thought we shouldn't even focus on intellectual attainment. We need to just focus on love of authority, discipline, and devotion to the state. He thought that open discussion and critical thinking should not be tolerated. That sounds like my public school experience. I might be biased. I did not have a great
that was my experience.
I think we've talked in our previous episode about how you and I both got in trouble for going, wait a minute, isn't it this actually? And even though we were right, we got in trouble. Yeah. So that's where this idea comes from. In large part is Hall. He thought that you're not in school to learn or to think. You're there to learn obedience and devotion to the state. We don't want your opinions. We don't want to hear your thoughts or your questions on things. And then, this idea that empathy or sympathy towards undesirables interfered with selection toward the super race. So he was yet another person who was a believer in this idea of steering human evolution toward creating a super race. It's kind of crazy that only the Mean Mr. Mustache clan gets hit with this rap, right? It's like so many of these people and so many eugenicists, and it was very popular. Darwinism made eugenics. It was like the next logical step, right? Oh, well, if we figured out evolution, I guess we better start steering it and controlling it and manipulating it to what we want and create a super race of superhumans, which then becomes transhumanism.
Yeah, it's essentially the Ubermensch is the transhuman, which leads to the posthuman. These are just some interesting connections with Hall. He was at Antioch College, And during his brief time there, he came under the influence of Horseman, again, who we created the modern education system, the Unitarian Church, which you were talking about, the Hegelian discussion group, which was mostly left Hegelians, and then the co-founder of the Order of Skull and Bones, who was Alfonso Taft. And Alfonso Taft was also he also knew William Howard Taft, who was also a member and a Chief Justice of the United States, as we know. Yeah. So those are some of his, and he was influenced by Hartman, Edward von Hartman, who was a prominent philosopher, and his views, it was also very similar. He was all like against the individual. He says that he believed that there shouldn't be any individual rights, that the principle of freedom is negative in every department of life. He saw religion alone compulsory is necessary. What all men need is rational tyranny, if it only holds them to a steady development according to the laws of their own nature. So essentially, he thought that tyranny was the only way to survive and, function. And he was really influenced by Fechner, who was also like one of his primary focuses was on parapsychology and what they call psychophysics. So.
Yeah. Yep. And another thing G. Stanley Hall thought was that, and this is another weird reference to Atlantis, is why this keeps coming up, and I'm like, what the heck? But he said that he thought American individualism would sink the United States like Atlantis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He thought individualism was like the ultimate evil. Now, I think there's a time and a place for individual identity as well as collective identity. Mm-hmm. When you're with your friends, when you're at your church, when you're in your parish, those are times when it's a collective identity can be a good thing. But we always, like in my church, we would always have respect for the individual identity as well, because God creates each of us differently with our own special skills, talents, and ways that we can glorify him. So for me, that's like the guiding principle of this idea of individualism and collectivism kind of working together, not strictly one or strictly the other. You get into trouble with both of those. So
I think I think that's the lie, that's the Hegelian dialectic that they want to create, a false dialectic. They want you to be either in one camp or the other, because if you're in the radical individualized camp, then you're in a very much kind of like Luciferian, Mandevillean type of
will to power.
Yeah, exactly. Will to power, but also this idea of virtue through sin, because we are inherently flawed, right? So we may as well use those sins as a means to aspire, advancement and evolution. Right? That this is like the Adam Smithian principle. Mm-hmm. And that's what a lot of people don't know, is that it was actually based on Mandeville principles. So it is literally a Luciferian, eugenics, Malthusian philosophy. And then on the other side, you have the, New Age, the, it's still, I would argue, still Luciferian, but it is under this notion of it being, it's a paganistic type of view that you're, all one, and that there is no individual. And I think really the truth is so plainly obvious that it lies in the middle, that, we're obviously all so intricately interwoven and connected, and we have such tremendous impact on each other. But that doesn't negate the individuality and individuation. Right. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. That you put it very well.
Thank you. So.
That's all I have on Hall.
Okay. I have one other thing on Wundt, and I think I actually mentioned it last time, but I think it's still worth mentioning. It was his grandfather on the paternal side was I'm going to say it wrong because I can never pronounce these German names. Kirchenherot. Something like that. Karl Casimir Wundt was his grandfather, and he was a professor at Heidelberg University. And the Illuminati order documents show that he was known to be Raphael. So Wilhelm Wundt's grandfather was literally in the Illuminati.
Of course.
Yeah.
That sounds right. Goodness. Yeah. So it's just bizarre. You always think you're just going to do a little bit of historical study and it always ends up leading to these crazy things.
Crazy.
That's the fun of it, right? That's the fun of it when you find this stuff. So, the next person I have on my list that I wanted to talk about was Emil Kraepelin. Again, a German name. I'm probably saying it wrong. But he was really important because he was the founder of modern scientific psychiatry, which is kind of, I'm not even going to go all the way through with him because he starts early 1900s and then goes all the way through World War II. But at the beginning, so we're in like pre-World War I era, this is when modern scientific psychiatry was started, and
the doctoring of the soul. So we have the study of the soul, and now we have the doctoring.
And this is where a lot of the drugs and the treatments and things like this come from. So I think it's really important because I think Courtenay and I are on the same page in regard to our skepticism about modern psychiatric medical treatments for people. And it's always been pretty crazy. So he was the first person to really put forward this strong idea that psychiatric illness was biological and genetic. There's some truth to that, but they have also found, like Courtenay said, that it's not a dyed-in-the-wool thing. Epigenetics is like 80% responsible for disease development. So like Rob Wolf always says, genetics loads the gun and epigenetics pulls the trigger, right? So it depends. It depends. Just because you have certain genes doesn't mean that all of those genes are going to end up giving you disease or different or good or bad things. It depends. But he had like a very firm idea that genetics was all there was to it. That everything's genetic, that there's no way around that. There's nothing you can do about it. And he began at the University of Leipzig, where Wundt was, and had his first experimental psychology lab. And he studied under Wundt as well.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote the Compendium of Psychiatry in 1883, which is kind of the first, is kind of like a DSM-5-ish type of a manual for its day, but we're talking 1883, so this is a long time ago. In 1912, he got funding from, I know his name. Why didn't I put it here? The same, let me Google it. I think it's Loeb, the German Jewish banker who funded a lot of this stuff at the time.
German Jewish banker. Not the Rothschilds.
No, but he was connected with them.
Okay.
I like literally was writing so fast that I skipped the actual word because I usually know it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was him. But he got all of this funding to create the German Institute for Psychiatric Research in Munich in 1917. And this became super influential. It became basically, it was the German Institute for Psychiatric Research, which then became the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. And they got this huge Rockefeller Fund donation, which turned it into like a giant tentacle monster of MK Ultra stuff later. I'm just gonna double check that, but go ahead if you've got anything relating. Jeez. I don't know if you went as far as to get into like the right before the war German stuff.
Yeah, I didn't do too much at that point because I kind of thought that we would go through a lot of that next week, but
yeah, that's why I'm kind of just going right up to the beginning of it so we have a spot to start.
Yeah.
James Loeb, that's who it was. A Jewish German-American banker, James Loeb. If you read Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, that one by my goodness, I need some cocaine and meth from Freud so that my brain. Who did you just bring up the Skull and Bones book? Professor what? The Skull and Bones book.
Professor Sutton?
Yes. Professor Sutton's book on Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, he talks about this guy because he was sending a lot of funding to them and Trotsky and different people too. He was a big part of this Wall Street banking cartel that was funding all kinds of craziness during World War I. So he gave him most of the money to start this German Institute for Psychiatric Research in 1917, going right in, this is right around the beginning of World War I. And this is when the Rockefeller family really took interest in psychology and psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in large part because of the fact that they were into eugenics, and the Rockefellers were big fans of that at the time. And Kraepelin was in some ways, he was kind of a good guy, or was trying to be, because he wanted psychiatric asylums to be less barbaric. He didn't want capital punishment or like a lot of restraining of people and things like that, which you could argue was probably good. But he is the one who really pioneered sedating the hell out of everybody. He used potassium bromide first, and then was really the one to kind of start pioneering all the different drugs that you could control people with. And he was, again, social Darwinist, racial hygiene, eugenics, very into all of that. And oddly, in the later years of his life, he became really into Buddhism and the Buddhist teachings on death and stuff like that, which is just another, Eastern mysticism again. So this guy who was this like racial hygienist ends up being a Buddhist right before he dies. Like, oh, how nice for you. How nice for you to like want to wipe out a bunch of people and then decide at the end of your life that you want to be a peaceful Buddhist.
That's very convenient,
isn't it?
It's like there's no atheists in foxholes, That's, kind of reminds me of that.
Yes, that's what happens a lot with these people. And he was, another reason he's so important is because one of his students was Ernst Rudin, who was one of the more notorious Mean Mr. Mustache Clan eugenic doctors who was in charge of their main program. And Ernst Rudin, he was a psychologist, psychiatrist, medical doctor who studied under Eugene Bleuler, who was like another similar thing. All these people at the time were eugenicists for the most part. And Rudin studied social Darwinism and racial hygiene. He was the co-editor-in-chief of the Archive for Racial Hygiene and Social Biology in 1904. 1905, he was the co-founder for the German Society for Racial Hygiene. So this was science at the time. I think people need to understand that, because everybody's under the impression that no one knew this was happening. No one knew this was going on until World War II, when we had, when we liberated the camps and we found out about all the horrible things that were going on, and everyone was shocked and surprised and nobody knew. And it's like, that's completely false. Margaret Sanger was, parading around the United States and Europe, championing eugenics. We had eugenics societies here. We had them in Europe from the like 1880s until the end of World War II. It was the mainstream science. It was very accepted. There was only some pushback by like, Christians, fundamentalist Christians, things like that, who were against it. But the scientific community thought this was what we had to do, because everything was based on evolution. Everything was based on Darwinism. So social Darwinism and biological Darwinism equals eugenics. It was the mainstream view at the time. So we can't really just have this historical revisionism of saying, oh, it was just this one party of Germans who was up to this shenanigans. This was really widespread.
Widespread. And it's really, I feel like in every time we start diving into any of these topics, it really is the philosophy and the worldview behind all of it.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. I mean, and I think they loved it so much because you're thinking about Thomas Malthus 100 years before. Right. And his theories of like Malthusian, like, oh, there's only so much stuff to go around, so we have to depopulate, we have to control nature. It's always this like idea that,
but somehow they have to control nature, so it never seems to affect them. That's always the interesting.
Well, I think it's because they think they're the gods. From their occultic beliefs and their worldview, it's like, well, someone has to be at the top and steer everything. Somebody has to be in control, and we're the smart people. We are the learned ones. We're in all these societies and these secret societies, and we're in these intellectual circles, and we're going to sit around and dictate what needs to happen. And so it was like, this was really the dominant medicine and psychology of the time. It was not. It wasn't specific to National Socialists in Germany at all.
No, not at all. I mean, obviously, a lot of these groups are, we're seeing them in England. We're seeing them in France. I have a group here. It's in Poland. So it's really through these elite and academic circles. That's not at all relegated to one geographical locus. But what I was going to say is that I think another really important component for people to understand is that this is what we were saying before about how these philosophies always seem to somehow justify their views. And I think that that's the case with psychology. So, they created things like, intelligence testing. They created means of determining disability and mental disability and mental illness. And they systematized it and labeled it and codified it in ways that substantiate. It's literally like a blueprint for their confirmation bias and a way to corral people towards their worldview and to justify, the fact that they want to kill off tons of people and the fact that they want to take control over people that they deem to be less than. And they do it all under the guise that they're being, so helpful and that it's for the betterment of humanity, when really it's just for them to have control and then for them to have you feel good about them taking control.
Right. Because in order to do all of this benevolent stuff, they need control over all the resources and the money and everything. They need control over everything in order to save us, right? It's always to save you from whatever's about to happen if they don't help you. But I think we'll kind of head into wrapping this up, guys. So if you have any last minute questions or comments, send it through the Dono chat. We both have Dono chat links pinned to the top. So if you enjoyed this and you want to support the show, please do that. If you have questions or comments, click the Dono chat link. It's super easy, really quick to make a donation. So go ahead, Courtney. What were you saying?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think one other thing I don't know if we covered was the Society for Psycho Research.
Yes, I do have a little bit on that.
Okay, because that was kind of one of the things also that brought psychology to the United States. And it was literally the study of thought transmission and telepathy, essentially. But they coined it thought transmission because that was more scientific.
Yes. Yeah, like these were basically a bunch of nerdy weirdos and pervs. We'll get into that next week. There's a lot of perviness going on here too.
But I also think it's so relevant when you talk about things like MK Ultra, right? Because that's essentially, it's like a precursor to all of this like remote viewing kind of projects that they did. Yes.
Yeah, they were doing a big part of this was because part of it was because spiritualism was so big at the time.
That's the chapter that this is in, actually. It's called Spiritualism, and it's called Occultism Made in the USA, and then the first part of it is Spiritualism. I don't know if people can see, but that's,
Yeah. So, yes, a large part of the early studies of all of these mainstream psychologists that you're never going to hear this in your like American history class, or if you go to school for psychology, they're just going to tell you the nice bullet points. They're not going to tell you that these people are all trying to study remote viewing, telepathy, ESP, all of the paranormal stuff. So it was called the Society for Psychical Research. And then there was another one that was like a paranormal research. But many of these people dabbled in lots of paranormal psychology and established paranormal psychology as a field. So that was a big part of it too. That's why many of them were hypnotists or used different types of hypnotism. There was some really, really bizarre wackadoo stuff going on. They had what else was I just thinking of? The idea that like there was one guy who had this idea that the sinuses were connected to like the reproductive organs, and he was doing weird sinus surgeries on people. This was kind of an excuse for, and I've noticed this in my own life, a lot of people who have their own mental illness struggles want to be psychologists, right?
My mom always says research is me search.
Yes. Yes. So I think that in this case, that was super true, because everybody involved in the founding of the field was, some of them were a little off. Some of them had some issues. Some of them had some problems. You guys might know that about people like Freud and Jung. They were not like exceptions. They're the ones that history remembers. But most of these people had their own mental health struggles, or thought they might be psychics, or thought they could hypnotize people, or wanted to see what they could do to people. And then when we get in next week to things like sexology emerging as a field, guess what those people were all, they were all sexual deviants who were, I'm just scientifically studying my sexual deviance. So nothing to see behind this curtain, right? So it's like, it's kind of like how often in our research we find that if there's a nonprofit group or some kind of philanthropic group and they're saying, oh, we're helping these people, those are usually the people that they're exploiting or harming. It's kind of similar to that, where it's like the crazy people want to be in charge of everyone's mental health, and the pervy people want to be the sexologists and do experiments on everyone. So you can see, I think, just from the stuff that we've talked about tonight, where we're talking about things like hypnotism, parapsychological research, telepathy, and then we're experimenting with drugs to hypnotize and influence people, and of course under the guise of curing them. And some of them may have been very sincere in that. Some of them may have been. It doesn't really matter, though, because you're still messing with stuff that you don't know what you're messing with. And it requires all this experimentation, all this human experimentation with drugs, with techniques that later we're going to find, of course, are going to be used for very nefarious purposes. Because if you could control the minds of people, if you could steer the psyche of people, if you could control the biology of people, if you can control the evolution of the human species, which I would say I don't think there's macroevolution, but let's just say like the microevolution, the adaptation of the species. If you can control the biology and the psyche of the species, who are the kinds of people who do you think are going to be interested in that sort of thing? And so those people right away went, ooh, I like this. Where can I invest?
Right.
So going into World War I is where we're going to see, okay, there's been enough research. It's been established as a science, although I would argue it wasn't scientific whatsoever. But you'll see the worst people in the world with the most money really heavily invest and basically take this over. So even if you wanted to look back at this and say these people had good intentions, I think a lot of them probably did. But whenever you're talking about controlling human beings, there's going to be bad people with lots of money who are going to want to invest and kind of take that over, which is what ends up happening. So, what do you think on wrapping up this episode?
I think so. I think we, covered. Yeah, I think it's we're pretty much right around the 1912, right, which is where lots of fun stuff commences.
Yeah, people always ask me if I think there was like turning points, and in modern history I always would say like 1913 is definitely a year that a lot of stuff started popping off, and 1912 was like
1912 was just gearing up, and so much. And 1913 was definitely a huge turning point for sure.
There was just so many things that came together, and then we're gonna see, as always, that in the theater of war, they're able to do all kinds of craziness that they normally wouldn't be able to get away with. So that's when Courtenay and I both are kind of in agreement that we think a lot of the MK Ultra type experimentation actually started in World War I. not in 1953.
No.
And so we'll kind of go over next week. Should be super exciting. These last two, if you liked these two, I think you're going to love the next few that we do, because we're going to really get into these. We're kind of laying the groundwork for the absolute madness, pun intended, that happens for the next 100 years. And then we take a look at where we think we are now to wrap it up. So I hope you guys like the series and you follow it. Yeah. The best is yet to come for sure.
Yeah, and just to Rachel's point about, wartime research and how they use that as a cover to get away with doing all sorts of really, really inhumane things. I think a great example is just think about ARPA. It was the Advanced Research Project Agency. Then it became DARPA, right? So I always say that as soon as they put a D in front of it for defense, then they have a carte blanche black ops budget. They can do whatever they want, and they can do it in secrecy and tell you one thing while they're doing whatever they want. And we're going to see that, when we start talking about Tavistock next week. It was literally the British Propaganda Bureau, and they created it under the guise that they had to, because their enemies, the Germans, had a propaganda bureau. So of course they had to have a propaganda bureau. But well, certainly, I guess, we can say that they definitely did do propaganda, but it had very little to do with creating defense and protection from, foreign invaders. So,
yes. Yeah. So I think that's a good place to
wrap up.
Check our dono chats. Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
I don't have any, so I'm going to let you go.
You guys better give Courtenay dono chats. She works very hard. Okay, I do have a few. So thank you guys.
Let's go through it.
Thank you guys so much for the dono chats on my end.
Yeah.
I have one from Willie Jenkins. I love your screen name, Willie. He says, keep nailing the Prussian system, missing trivium, and smart, strong, but still feminine woman topics. Don't give an inch. Well, I won't. And I know Courtenay won't. I already know she won't. Like,
for sure.
You ain't gonna get her to cave on anything. So thank you so much, Willie. That was so nice of you. We got a $10 donation from RC. No message. Thank you so much for that donation. Really appreciate that. And then we have $5 from Kristen Slowboy. Shout out Kristen. She's my pal. We love her. She said, this talk was excellent. Looking forward to next week. I saw in the chat she was very excited to learn that this is a series. So
yay.
Yay. And then we also have a $5 donation from Neurojack. He asks, what came first, the demons or the idea egregore / practice? Wow, that's a really deep question, Neurojack.
You go, and then I actually have some thoughts on that.
Okay. I mean, I would say the demons, but that's just because, if you're Christian, we think that the demons came about as a reaction to humanity being made in the image of God. They didn't like that. So I think there's the reason you can look back across time. We've got like 6,000 years of recorded history. We can look back and see the same patterns. I mean, the majority of what Courtenay and I do is noticing patterns. And you can look back over 6,000 years and see the same patterns over and over through every age. And I think the reason for that, how could there be such continuity across time? How could there be, it doesn't seem to matter what age you're in. There's a group of elites who are doing evil stuff. How could that be? Well, it's the same spirits behind this. It's the same demonic entities who have been around for a long time and really know what works best on us and really know how to cause chaos, problems, suffering, and evil. And I think that that's ultimately beneath all the layers of everything. I think that's what's there. Mm-hmm. And I think that the good news is that God can use those things for our salvation, to transform us and to edify us and to divinize us and to provide a way for us to have salvation and go back to him. So I think the demonic came first. But I think there's always, the thing about salvation is it's not very sexy and it's not always glamorous or fun, right? You do suffer in this life, and there's always going to be some people who are going to see the demonic allure of like, don't you want to be God? Don't you think you should be in charge? I mean, you have all this knowledge, you have all this gnosis. I think that's why intellectuals get swept into it, like the people we're talking about. They get this because they're all in a circle patting each other on the back about how smart they are. They just sit in secret societies sniffing their own farts and thinking that they're like so much smarter than everyone else. You know what I mean? I just saw a TikTok video of this horrific teacher, and she was screaming and yelling at the school board about homeschooling and how homeschooling needed to be eliminated because she said, "We're the teachers. We have master's degrees in education. What do these parents have?" And I'm thinking, lady, do you want to do a debate right now? Because I guarantee your master's ain't going to do crap when you actually have to deal with someone who knows how to think. So I think it makes these people very self-important, and they do start thinking, yeah, why shouldn't I run things? Why shouldn't we be in charge? I think the demonic can tempt these people that way. So I think they came first, and then the practice of worshiping or emulating them, taking the deal, thinking that you're going to be God, you're going to get something out of this. I think that came second. What do you think, Courtney?
Yeah, so this is something I've really spent a lot of time thinking about, and I was actually having a conversation with my fiance about this earlier today, about how I think people can work reverse. So it's one thing if you come from the religious framework, and that's, then you have that foundation. But there are a lot of people who don't. And I would say that, right now, I think we're in a really interesting time because a lot of people are waking up, quote unquote, and a lot of people are really searching, and they're searching for spiritual kind of, they're finding religion for the first time, or they're being more open to it for the first time, but they don't have that foundation. And I can say that for myself. What I think I talked about this on the last episode, that I was going through this from much more academic perspective. I was studying Marxism and philosophy, and the more that I studied, the more I learned about Satanism, essentially. That was really what just kept coming up. And so, but what's fascinating is a lot of people always say to me, I think you probably get this question a lot too, is like, how can you study like such darkness? Isn't that like so depressing? And doesn't that leave you filled with despair? And what's so interesting? The irony is that when I studied the reverse, I studied the lie essentially, because a lot of these Marxist philosophies, and I would put, I wrote my thesis on existential authenticity. And so I very much like fell into, I now can see the lie, because they sold it to you as it being empowering. You get to essentially be your God. You're defining your own path, and you're completely in charge. And the irony is that actually leaves you feeling more filled with despair, because there is no real purpose. And so it's not that I don't think that we have any role in creating meaning and purpose in our own lives. I absolutely think we do. And even if you have a biblical worldview, I think that still holds true. But there is still something so much more, while it's humbling, it's also really empowering and comforting to know that there is a greater purpose, that there is a spiritual realm, and that there is a eternal component, and that it isn't just the here and now. But I say all this just to say that when you start going back, you see the spiritual battle. And as you so beautifully said, that that's why these patterns crop up throughout time, throughout as far as we have any record of humanity and of entities dealing with each other. We see this battle play out. We see the same themes recurring repeatedly. But what I think is where the question comes for a lot of people, especially if they don't have that foundation, because there is an element of faith, right? If you are a religious person, that's just inherent and intrinsic to being a believer, that there is a leap of faith. And I think that if you don't have that foundation, then you may see that. But what the big question becomes is that prior to the written word, right? Just chronologically speaking, we have all these writings from the ancient mystics and from the pagans. And so in terms of, written text and what's been documented, that precedes the biblical word. And so I think this is where the the question arises, I think, for people, and so if you take it from the biblical framework, it's that always existed, but the recording came afterwards. And so and if that is true, again, I don't claim to have the answer, and I'm not telling anybody what to believe, because I think we have free will, and I believe that part of free will is freedom of consciousness. And so it's incumbent on each person, that's their path. Interestingly enough, the word Israel literally means to wrestle. And when you read the Torah, like, that's the whole theme, is that it is about wrestling with God. It's about wrestling with faith and asking the questions. So I think that's really important, and I welcome that for everybody. That's I believe that's part of our path. We're here to do that. So, but if you do believe that, then it would make sense that, yes, the spirits came first, and this is spiritual battle. And then of course, the practices are just because they work through the physical entities, which would be humans, in order to play out the battle. So.
Yep, that is correct. Oh, we got one more from Anglo Christian for $10. Thank you so much. He or she says, I'd like to see you ladies do a dive into Gerald Gardner, founder of Wicca. My own dive cured me of my paganism. And then he just also said that your dono chat was not linked in my description. That is true. If you guys go to Courtenay Turner's YouTube, Rockfin, or Rumble, you can find her on any of those three. Subscribe to her there, by the way,
because I'm very censored. I've had to start many new channels.
And you guys, if you like my content, you're gonna love her content. And she puts out more volume than I do. She's like banging them out every day or two. She has great guests all the time. She's the one that did that amazing panel with Jay and James Lindsay, and she does amazing stuff. So definitely go find her, depending on which one you like. I mean, Rockfin and Rumble are obviously ideal. I'm going to get on there. I know I'm going to get on there. But go find her there, and she has the Dono Chat link there. And just a reminder too, you can send us tips on Dono Chat even if you miss the live. So if you're watching this after, you can always send Courtenay a donation. You can send her a suggestion for what you'd like to see her cover. If you want to see us both cover something. So definitely do that. It's just, since she is so incredibly censored, it's incredibly hard for her to monetize her work, which is, I think, horrible. So please go support her on all of her stuff if you're watching from my channel. Just because I am still on YouTube for now. But that's why we love Dono Chat. It gives her a chance to monetize her content without having to worry about the powers that be. Because everything she does makes them mad.
Yes, and just so you know, I get this comment from people all the time. You forgot to upload to YouTube. No, I did not forget to upload to YouTube. I do not upload everything to YouTube because I actually want to just keep this channel up, just to have a presence there. And yes, I could do like little clips or do a starting and then go elsewhere, but I really like to have my conversations be organic, and I don't want to censor my guests. And so sometimes things come up pretty early on, and we can speak in code so much, but one of the reasons I started doing this was because I felt like one of the biggest problems with people who are outside of mainstream narratives is that they engage in autocritique. I knew enough about the Maoist struggle sessions to know that didn't work so well for them. And I really just didn't want to be a part of the problem. So it's kind of really just to bring up authenticity. It's just kind of very much out of alignment with my own personal authenticity. I started this as a mission to not be part of the problem. So that's part of why. So if the episode just isn't gonna work, and I of course I have to use a little bit of discernment. We don't always know. I've already gotten a strike on this one, so but it's just one. It was one warning. So I'm really trying to be careful. And I've had like close friends who obviously follow me and look for my work, and they still can't find my channels. So so it's definitely, the algorithm is not like.
Well, I'll go back and post too, and I'll add all your links to my description box too, just because I know people are going to be interested in your show and want to follow you. So definitely do that, everybody.
Thank you. Well, thank you. This was awesome. Yeah, I'm excited for the next one.
I have a plan to write articles on each episode and upload it to my Substack, because what we go over, it's so dense, and we're just like pumping out a lot of stuff. And I know people are probably like wanting to maybe dig into things more. So I will do like a written up kind of article version of this series, put it on my Substack with like links and citations and all that stuff for all of my nerdy friends who want to go in and get all that good stuff, you know? So it'll come up
if I can do anything to help any of those, let me know. Yeah,
I may just ask you for some source material for the stuff that you said, but that's about it. Otherwise, I'll put that up. So thank you guys all so much for watching, and we're excited for next time. So
yeah, thank you.